video, we are starting our discussion of social psychology. And so, first, let's talk about some definitions. Social psychology examines how people affect one another. So, it looks at the power of the situation, how you are influenced by the real, the imagined, or the perceived presence of other people. The field of social psychology studies topics at the intra and interpersonal level. So when we talk about intrapersonal, this is about the individual. So this is going to study things like social cognition, attitudes, emotions, and interpersonal topics are going to be more than one person. This is going to study things like prejudice and discrimination or altruistic behaviors. For social psychology, a big thing to think about is situationism versus dispositionism. Situationism is the view that our behavior and actions are determined by our immediate environment and our surroundings. So it is your environment that influences what you think, how you act, how you feel. Dispositionism says that our behavior is determined by internal factors. An internal factor is an attribute. So for internal factors, these attributes, this is going to be things like your personality traits, your temperament, and modern social psychology looks at both situationism and dispositionism when trying to figure out what is happening. It's not just situationism because it's social psychology. We focus on how they interact with each other. One way, I'm going to move this up here, that we look at this situational versus dispositional attributions is with the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error says that people tend to overemphasize internal factors as explanations for the behavior of other people. So in general, the average person is going to use too many dispositional attributions. You are doing this because it's your personality, it's your temperament, it's who you are. And not enough situational attributions. It is the environment that led you to act this way. So we tend to ignore how social factors, social attributes affect who we are. So one experiment connected with this done by Ross, Amabile, and Steinmetz had students who were randomly assigned to be either the questioner, what they called the quizmaster, or a contestant in a quiz game. So if you were the quizmaster, you were told to think up some difficult questions that you knew the answer to. Just random facts you knew the answers to. And then they would ask those questions to the participants who had been assigned as contestants. And on average, they were hard questions. Contestants answered the questions correctly about 4 out of 10 times. After they answered these questions, the questioners, the quizmasters, and the contestants, as well as other participants who were just observers, who just watched this game, were asked to rate the general knowledge of the quizmasters and the contestants. So the quizmasters rated their own general knowledge and that of the contestants. The contestants rated their own general knowledge and that of the quizmasters. And then the participants who were just observing rated what they thought the general knowledge was of the quizmasters and the contestants. What they found was that the questioners, the quizmasters, rated their own general knowledge at the same as the contestants rated their general knowledge. So the contestant said, "This is how smart I think I am on average." That was the same rating as the quizmasters saying, "This is how smart I am on average." So everyone thought they personally were the same intelligence-wise. However, the contestants rated the quiz masters as being smarter than average. And the observers rated the quiz masters as being smarter than average. So the quiz masters didn't think they were extra smart, but the contestants and the observers thought the quiz masters were extra smart. This is the fundamental attribution error. So why did this happen? How does this relate to fundamental attribution error? What the observers and the contestants saw was that the quiz masters knew all the answers to these hard questions. And so when they were attributing a cause for this, why did these quiz masters know all the answers? They gave a dispositional attribution. It's because they're really smart people. They didn't give a situational attribution. They knew all the answers because they were told to think of hard questions they randomly knew the answers to. All they thought was, they know all the answers, it must be because they're smart. It must be something unique to them. They're smart people. The quiz masters didn't rate themselves as smarter than average because you don't have the fundamental attribution error for yourself. When the quiz masters were thinking, why did I know all the answers? They were not making a dispositional attribution. You can think about situational attributions for your own behavior. So the quiz masters were aware they knew all the answers because they were told to think of random questions they knew the answers to. It was the situation, not their own personal intelligence. But everyone else looking at what was happening attributed a dispositional attribution. Said the reason the quiz masters knew the answers is because they're really smart people. And so another sort of everyday example of this would be like Jeopardy. If you have a Jeopardy match, back when Alex Trebek was alive, you probably thought he was a smart person. I mean, he always knew the answers. Most people think Alex Trebek was a really smart guy. He was given all the answers. But when you're watching, it's easy to think, wow, he knows all the answers, he must be really smart. It's the situation, but we tend to make dispositional attributions when we're thinking about other people. For this, there is a difference in fundamental attribution error when it comes to individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. Individualistic cultures are cultures that focus on individual achievement and autonomy. The US is an individualistic culture. Collectivistic cultures focus on communal relationships with others. Examples of collectivistic cultures, a lot of countries in Latin America, a lot of Asian cultures are collectivistic. You see more fundamental attribution error in individualistic cultures. Because of that focus on the individual, a person's disposition is the primary explanation for behavior. Whereas for collectivistic cultures, because the focus is less on the individual, it's more on the group, it's more on the situation, you're less likely to see the fundamental attribution error in collectivistic cultures. The next thing to go over is bias. And so we're going to talk about actor-observer bias and then self-serving bias as well. The actor-observer bias is the phenomenon of attributing other people's behavior to internal factors. So that's, the fundamental attribution error. But what makes sort of the addition for the actor-observer bias, when you're doing it for yourself, you don't have the fundamental attribution error. You will use situational factors to explain your own behavior. And so the reason you see this, why you are more likely to use situational factors for yourself, is because you make the attribution for what you're observing when you do it. So when you are deciding, why did I act this way, you are looking at your environment. And so you're going to blame that environment. When someone else is deciding why you did something, they're looking at you. And so they're going to attribute the cause to you. So the actor-observer bias says you don't do fundamental attribution error for yourself. You use situational attributions for yourself. The self-serving bias is the tendency of an individual to take credit by making dispositional attributions for positive outcomes, but situational attributions for negative outcomes. For example, you bomb a test, it's because it was really hard. It's because you were distracted. It wasn't your fault. You ace a test, it's because you worked so hard or you're so smart. If something good happens, you will take credit for it. If something bad happens, you're not going to take the blame. And so there's 3 dimensions for this, for these attributions. You have locus of control, stability, and controllability. The locus of control can be internal or external. So what controlled what happened? Is it internal, dispositional, or external? Stability, is this action, is this outcome something that is going to stick around, something that's going to keep happening? Or is it changeable? Is it something that could turn out differently next time? And then controllability is how much the given outcome can be controlled. Was this, the circumstances that are associated with it, how much can you control those circumstances? And so if it's a good outcome, one you're going to take credit for, then it's going to be internal, dispositional. It's going to be stable, because you're going to keep being awesome. And it's going to be controllable. You set the situation in place that led to this amazing thing. If something bad happens, then it's external, situational. It's unstable. Maybe it'll be different next time. And it was uncontrollable. You had no say. You couldn't have changed what happened this time. So internal, stable, and controllable for good things. External, unstable, and uncontrollable for bad things. And so the next thing we're going to go over is the just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis is the belief that people get what they deserve. The world is a just place. It's the idea of karma. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. And so one negative consequence of just world thinking is that you tend to blame victims for the negative things that happen to them. There's a lot of things that can come out of just world thinking, by the way. So let me give you a few examples of this just world thinking. One example, a very common example on college campuses, if a woman is sexually assaulted, people will ask, what was she wearing? Was she drinking? Why was she putting herself in that situation? They're putting the blame on her. She is responsible for what happened, they think. If she had acted differently, if she had done stuff differently, this bad thing wouldn't have happened to her. And so another example is, what's a good other example? I'll give you a couple. One, if you hear someone has lung cancer, for most people, their first question is, were they smokers? When something bad happens, you want to think, did you somehow cause this to happen? Because if you had done things differently, if you hadn't been a smoker, then you wouldn't have lung cancer right now. Another example, when Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman. So Trayvon Martin was a high schooler who was walking home from a convenience store after buying like candy and iced tea. George Zimmerman thought he was a burglar, so he chased him down and shot him. And so, this was just a kid walking home from the store. He did not deserve to die. But it's really scary to think that a teenager can be walking down the street and just randomly killed. And so if you are high in just world thinking, if you are going to blame the victim, you will do what a lot of people, especially in the media, did after Trayvon Martin was murdered, where they were focusing on things like marijuana had been found in his locker one time. Because, if you are a teenager who smoked marijuana, you somehow deserve to be shot to death. But look, he's a bad guy. He's not a perfect angel, so he somehow brought this on himself. If he had acted differently, then he wouldn't be dead. If he'd been a better person, then he wouldn't be dead. And so the reason this just world thinking exists is because it can be a really scary world if you think that you can be trying to be a good person, you can be just living your life, and something horrible can happen. It is less anxiety provoking. It feels safer if we think, if I try to be a good person, good things will happen. And so that is how this just world thinking develops. We want to feel the world is safe. We want to think we're going to be protected. However, that means if there's any ambiguity when something bad happens to somebody, our first instinct is going to be to judge them versus being compassionate. This just world thinking applies to yourself as well. For example, there was a famous actor named Michael Landon who died before you were born. But he was famous for TV. He was the dad in Little House on the Prairie, again before your time, and Touched by an Angel, before your time. But he was a famous actor, very famous, well-known actor, who died of pancreatic cancer. And when he was sick, he was someone who was high in just world thinking. When he was sick, he gave an interview where he was talking about, if I hadn't drank so much, if I had lived a healthier life, then I wouldn't have cancer right now. You use just world thinking on yourself as well if you are high in it. It's not just for other people. But it can lead you to not help victims because you blame them for their fate. One sort of exception to that, though, people who are high in just world thinking, if it's someone who is an obvious victim, like there's no way they did this to themselves, then people who are high in just world thinking are kind of first in line to help. So, for example, one group that tends to be higher in just world thinking are evangelical Christians. And so a couple of signs of that, like, for example, when the AIDS crisis started in the U.S., late 80s, early 90s, through the 90s, most of the people who had AIDS in the U.S. were gay men. And so evangelical Christians were kind of first in line to be like, look at your lifestyle. You are causing this. If you weren't gay, you wouldn't have AIDS right now. You are being punished. You brought this on yourself. Which, again, not so helpful. But another huge group that had to deal with AIDS, especially in the 90s, were people in Africa. And they were not gay people. And so there were millions of orphans in Africa, orphaned because their parents died from AIDS. And so the number one group to create organizations to help these AIDS orphans, orphanages to help raise them, were evangelical Christians. Because you can't look at a 6-month-old who has AIDS from their mother and is now an orphan and say, you did this to yourself. Obvious victim. And so this group that's high in just world thinking, evangelical Christians, were first in line, contributed millions of dollars, millions of hours helping these AIDS orphans because there was no ambiguity if they had done something to deserve this. But if there is ambiguity, you're kind of first in line to judge. And the next thing to go over is social roles and social norms scripts. And then the final thing we'll talk about in this video is Zimbardo and his prison study. So that'll be it for this video. Social roles are a pattern of behavior that's expected of a person in a given setting or group. These are defined by your culture. Your culture says, in this role, this is how you are supposed to act. Social roles and the behaviors you do can vary across different settings. So it is, this is the role you have. This behavior you are expected to have. Like, for example, at McDaniel, you are a student. How do you act as a student? How do you act as a professor? That sort of thing. Here are the expected behaviors. Social norms are a group's expectation of what is appropriate and acceptable behavior for its members. So this is like if you are a member of a sorority or fraternity, this is how you are expected to act. If you're on a certain sports team, here's how the members of the team act at a game, at practice, in this setting. Because you are a part of this group, here is the way you act. And then your scripts are a person's knowledge about the sequence of events expected in a specific setting. So it's not based on a specific group membership. It's just in this environment, this is how you act. And this can be different across cultures or subcultures. It's basically information that helps guide your behavior. For example, if you get into an elevator and you stand backwards, you are going to feel really awkward because that is the social script in an elevator. You don't stand backwards. That's just weird. And again, these can vary based on your culture or subculture. For example, what's an example of this? For example, when I was in Rwanda the first time, I was young, I was 21. And so in Rwanda, when someone comes to visit you, you give them tea. And the women serve the tea. So here in this environment, this is what you do. Women are supposed to go get the tea, serve it to the men, and then they can go to another room and have their own tea. And so when I show up, because I'm a woman, it doesn't matter that I'm not Rwandan. It doesn't matter that I'm a guest there. I'm a woman. I am expected to still serve tea. So whenever people would come over, or even when I would go to other people's houses, because I was a woman in this event visiting, I still had to be the one to serve the tea to other people, even if I was actually the guest there. In the U.S., that's not, well, there might be some subcultures in the U.S. where the women have to serve tea no matter what. But in my subculture, just because I'm a lady doesn't mean I'm the one that has to go get everyone their drinks. So different subcultures or different cultures can have different scripts. Here is the way you act in this environment. And that also would be an example for social rules, because as a woman, here was what I was expected to do. But generally, tea serving would be the social script. So how does this relate to Zimbardo and his prison study? Zimbardo, oh, bless his heart. He did this experiment. Now, a couple of things. One, he kind of stole the idea of this experiment from one of his students, which is not cool to do. And he did not give that student credit. Very not cool. And then another complaint I have with Zimbardo is that he kind of lied. So he said that the general gist of this experiment, it was going to be for 2 weeks. It went so horribly wrong, they had to cancel it after 6 days. He said that he randomly chose half of the participants to be prison guards, half the participants to be prisoners, and then just said, okay, go have this prison. And that it sort of organically happened that it became really abusive and they had to shut it down. That was a lie. He told the prison guards what sort of he was expecting, and then they went and acted that way. They were following what they thought the social rules were for them as prison guards. They were following, and them and the prisoners were following sort of what they thought the social norms were for people in prisons, prisoners, prison guards. But so So it was not as organic, and this is just naturally what happened, as he said. He was lying. But he did. He had a group of prison guards. He made this fake prison in the basement of the psychology department at Stanford, and it just went horribly, horribly wrong. And so I'm going to show you the video of that. But before I do, I'm going to mention a few other principles that you are going to see that connect with what happened. So in addition to seeing how these social roles and social norms scripts play out, he also used de-individuation. And so de-individuation is when, you know what, hold on, do I talk about this more later? I think I do. But I'll mention it now, and then it'll be easier to go through later. So de-individuation is when you see yourself as less of an individual. So it's a loss of your personal identity. You just become one of a group. And so the prison guards, when they were putting on their sunglasses so you couldn't see their eyes, when they were thinking, I'm just a prison guard, I am not Bob being mean, I'm prison guard being mean, it was easier for them to be violent. It was easier for them to degrade the prisoners. You see this, for example, in riots, like after the Super Bowl, whatever team wins, their fans go and like destroy streets. Each individual person would not necessarily do that, but when you're in this big group, you feel less personal responsibility. It's the group doing it. Another thing you will see in this video is dehumanization. And dehumanization is when you see someone else as less than human. You take away some of their humanity. And so there's lots of ways that this happens. In the video, the way it happens is they give them a number versus a name. So they're calling the prisoners a number and not a name. They're putting them in this uniform. There's no individuality. You see this a lot in like war or in groups that hate each other. You will think of horrible names for your enemy. So for example, in the Holocaust, the Nazis called the Jews rats. Like, who's sad about killing rats? In the Rwandan genocide, the Hutus called the Tutsis cockroaches and snakes. Again, I'm not sad if a cockroach dies. It made it easier to hurt these people if you saw them as less than you. In the US, oftentimes enslaved people were depicted as monkeys or gorillas because it made the slave owners feel better about trying to own someone else, enslaving somebody else, because they weren't as human as they were. So we dehumanize our victims to make us feel better. So you're going to see that as well in this video. So watch this video now.
Stanford University, Northern California, one of America's most prestigious academic institutions, and in 1971, the scene of one of the most notorious experiments in the history of psychology.
I was interested in what happens if you put good people in an evil place. Does the situation outside of you, the institution, come to control your behavior, or does the things inside of you, your attitudes, your values, your morality, allow you to rise above a negative environment?
The negative environment Zimbardo chose to test his ideas was a prison. He would convert the basement of the university's psychology department into a subterranean jail.
We put prison doors on each of 3 office cells. In the cells, there was nothing but 3 beds, and there was actually very little room for anything else because they were very small. And here we had solitary confinement, which we call the hole. And in the hole was the place where prisoners would be put for punishment. It was a very, very small area. When you closed the door, it was totally dark. all the guards wore military uniforms, and we had them wear these silver reflecting sunglasses. And what it does is you can't see someone's eyes, and so that loses some of the humanness, the humanity. In general, we wanted to create a sense of power. That is, the guards as a category are people who have power over others, in this case, power over the prisoners.
Zimbardo was interested in the power of social situations to overwhelm individuals. His experiment would test people's responses to an oppressive regime. Would they accept it or act against it? Zimbardo's experiment was conducted against a backdrop of civil rights activism and protest against the Vietnam War.
There was a sense of student power, student dominance, and student rebellion against authority in general.
It was from the student body that Zimbardo selected his participants. After passing tests to screen out anyone with a psychological abnormality, they were paid $15 a day. Each was randomly assigned to the role of guard or prisoner.
I was 20, and that September I was going to college, and it would be nice to have a summer job, but there sure wasn't a lot of time left. And I looked in the want ads, and I found this thing which was just going to fit. It was just 2 weeks.
I was on summer break from my first year in college, and I was looking for a job. Had to choose between that and making pizzas. That sounded like a lot more fun.
Prisoners were brought to the basement prison blindfolded to confuse them about their whereabouts. They were stripped and deloused.
Of course, the guards started making fun of their genitals and humiliating them. And really, it's the start of what's known as the degradation process, which not only prisons, but lots of military-type outfits use that process.
I recall sort of walking up and down the very short hallway, which was the prison hall, and looking in on the prisoners, and they're basically lounging around on their beds. I felt it was like a day in summer camp.
The first day I said, this might be a very long, very boring experiment, because it's conceivable nothing will happen.
I arrived independently at the conclusion that this experiment must have been put together to prove a point about prisons being a cruel and inhumane place, and therefore I would do my part, to help those results come about. I was a confrontational and arrogant 18-year-old at the time, and I said somebody ought to stir things up a bit here.
I didn't expect a rebellion because not much happened. I mean, it wasn't clear what they were rebelling against, but they were rebelling against the status, rebelling against being anonymous, against having to follow orders from these other students. The guards felt that they now have to up the ante of being tough. The prisoners made the mistake of beginning to use profanity against the guards in a very personalized way. So not against the guards, but, you little punk, you big shit, and so forth. And the guards got furious.
Prisoners were repeatedly woken in the middle of the night. The guards made them do menial, physical tasks and clean out toilets with their bare hands.
We made it a point to not give them any sense of comfort or what to expect, that anything could happen to them at any time, including being rousted from their sleep at any hour. I think that I was the instigator of this whole schedule of harassment.
The harassment of the guards took its toll on rebellion leader 8612. He told Zimbardo he wanted to leave the experiment.
I said, well, I can see to it the guards don't hassle you personally, and in return, all I would like is some information from time to time about what the prisoners are doing. So essentially I'm saying, I'd like you to be a snitch, an informer. And I said, think it over, and if you still want to leave, fine.
Confused, prisoner 8612 returned to his cell and told the other prisoners that no one could leave.
That really transformed the experiment into a prison.
Soon after returning to his cell, prisoner 8612 started showing signs of severe distress.
He came up with a plan that if he acted crazy, we would have to release him.
I feel so fucked up inside. I feel really fucked up inside. You don't know. I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I can't say that. I'm fucked up. I don't know how to explain it. I'm all fucked up inside. Help me out! Help me out now!
It starts with make-believe, and then he's doing it and cursing and screaming, and whatever that little boundary is that he moved across. Not that he became really crazy, but he became, excessively disturbed. I mean, so much so that we immediately said, we have to release him.
As an experience, it was unique. I've never screamed so loud in my life. I've never been so upset in my life. And it was an experience of being out of control.
It was one of the surprising things to me is that there was so little that the prisoners did to support one another after we started our campaign of, divide and conquer.
Isolated and distraught, prisoner 819 told Zimbardo he wanted to leave.
While I'm interviewing 819 and saying, okay, it's all over, thank you for your participation, I'll give you money for the whole 2 weeks, even though you're leaving early, he hears the prisoners shouting, 819 did a bad thing, and he said, I can't leave. And he's crying, and he says, I can't leave. I said, what do you mean you can't leave? He said, no, I have to go back, because I don't want them to think that I'm a bad prisoner. And that's when I really flipped out, that in such a short time, a college student's thinking could become so distorted. I said, you're not a bad prisoner, you're not a prisoner, and this is not a prison. And it was this thing where he opened his eyes, and it was just really like a cloud being lifted.
Seeing things clearly, prisoner 819 reverted to his original request and was released. To replace him, the experimenters called in one of their reserves from the standby list.
I got a phone call saying, are you still available as an alternate? Kind of cheery female secretary voice. I said, yes, sure. And so she said, could you start this afternoon? And I said, yes, sure. And my role in the experiment really began. I was blindfolded and then stripped and supposedly deloused.
He came into a madhouse, full blown. All of us had gradually acclimated to the increasing level of aggression, the increasing powerlessness of the prisoners, the increasing dominance of the guards. And he comes in and says, what's happening here to the other prisoners? And they said, hey, you better not make trouble. It's really terrible. It's a real prison. And he says, I'm out of here. I don't want to. And they said, no, you can't leave. Once you're here, you're stuck. This is a real prison.
Prisoner 416 was soon subjected to the harassment of Dave Eshelman, nicknamed John Wayne because of his macho attitude.
I just watched a movie called Cool Hand Luke, and the mean, intimidating, Southern prison warden character in that film really was my inspiration for the role that I created for myself.
He was creative in his evil. He would think up very ingenious ways to degrade, to demean the prisoners. One of the best guards was also on that shift, and instead of confronting this bad guard, the sadistic guard, essentially because he didn't want to see what was happening, he became the gopher. He would go out to get the food and things of this kind, and that left the John Wayne guard and another guard on that shift to be dominant.
Prisoner 416 decided to go on a hunger strike.
They were pushing my limits, but here was a thing that I could do that could push their limits.
I thought, how dare this newcomer come in and try to change everything that we had worked for the first 3 days to set up, and by God, he's going to suffer for that. We would use our nightsticks to bang on the door, and we would kick the door so hard that, it must have, shaken him very seriously inside, scared the life out of him.
He yelled at me and threatened me and actually sort of smashed a sausage into my face to try to get me to open up.
In fact, the prisoners accept the guard's definition of him as a troublemaker.
I remember some of them saying, would you eat, goddammit? We're sick and tired of this. And, that was proof that, there was no solidarity, there was no support between the prisoners. The study showed that power corrupts, and how difficult it is for people who are the victims of abuse to stand up and defend themselves. Why doesn't anybody who is being abused by a spouse or something like that just say, stop it? And we realize now that that's not as easy as it sounds.
By the end of the 5th day, 4 prisoners had broken down and been released. 416 was on the 2nd day of his hunger strike, and the experiment still had another 9 days to run. At this point, a fellow psychologist visited Zimbardo's basement prison and would witness the brutality of the experiment firsthand.
The guards had lined up the prisoners to go to the toilet, had bags over their head, chains on their feet, and were marching by. And I looked up and I saw this circus, this parade, and I said, "Hey, Chris, look at that."
I looked up and I just began to feel sick to my stomach. I had this just chilling, sickening feeling of watching this. And I just turned away. And I just let loose in this emotional tirade. I just lost it. I was angry, scared. I was in tears.
And I'm furious. I'm saying, you're supposed to, we had a big argument. You're supposed to be a psychologist. This is this interesting dynamic behavior in such a few days. I'm going through this whole thing, the power of the situation. She says, no, it's that young boys are suffering, and you are responsible. You're letting it happen. I said, oh my God, of course you're right.
The next day, Zimbardo ended the experiment. Studies like his stimulated heated debate about the ethics of using human subjects.
Clearly, young men suffered, verbally, physically. Prisoners felt shame in their role. Guards felt guilt. So in that sense, it's unethical. That is, nobody has the right, the power, the privilege to do that to other people.
When I look back on it now, I behaved appallingly. It was just horrid to look at.
Everyone was acting out a part and playing a role. Prisoners, guards, staff, everyone was acting out a part. It's when you start contributing to the script.
We like to think there is this core of human nature that good people can't do bad things and that good people will dominate over bad situations. In fact, one way to look at the Stanford Prison Study is that we put good people in an evil place and we saw who won. Well, the sad message is, in this case, the evil place won over the good people.
It did show some very interesting and maybe some unpleasant things about human behavior. It seems like, every century, every decade that we go through, we're suffering the same kind of atrocities, and you need to understand why these things happen. You need to understand why people behave like this.
And a final thing connected with this, and then it's done. A modern example of this is Abu Ghraib, which happened. Y'all were babies. You probably did not hear about this, but it was a prison in Iraq where American soldiers tortured and, in at least one case, killed Iraqi prisoners. And a lot of these factors that connected with the Zimbardo prison experiment connected with what happened at Abu Ghraib. Zimbardo was actually an expert witness in the trials for the prison guards who did the torture and all that abuse. And his idea was that it's not a few bad apples spoil the bunch, it's that a bad barrel spoils the apples. If you set up this environment that can lead to dehumanization, de-individuation, harmful and violent social norms and social roles, then that can lead to torture and killings. And that is it for this video.